Hello, everybody. A warm welcome from the rainiest and greyest, most, I'm going to use the word disgusting, although I am actually really grateful for the water, Sydney in Australia. I'm looking over there because I'm looking outside. You might see some palm trees and some things blowing in the background. Good afternoon, good morning, good night. I know it's various different times, obviously, all around the world. I'd like to warmly welcome you to our webinar on grief and growth. My name is Vashti Whitfield, if you don't know already, and I have with me who's become a growingly dear friend. Although we've only recently met, I'm sort of madly in love with her. I'd like to welcome Maryanne Larkin. And her story and her journey, I'm going to use the J word, will unfold in today's webinar. So I'd like to set up a couple of different key expectations, I guess. Today is really a conversation, as with everything I do. It's a conversation about what grief is, how grief manifests in our life, our expectation of what we think grief is in the world, our relationship with grief. And we're going to share our different stories and experiences with that. I want to talk about what grief actually is in terms of its stages very briefly, but then I want to expand the conversation out and look at how can we lean into grief as an opportunity to allow ourselves or perhaps others or even the legacy of loss to create growth. Remember that we only have an hour together. So as I said, this is more of a conversation, a dipping in and out. There's going to be opportunities in the future to go into much more detail in certain areas. And obviously, everybody's experience is very, very, very different. I'm a big fan of not generalizing people's stories. So please, whatever you're going through, wherever you're at, however you feel in your relationship with grief, please honor that and just be open to some of the things that we're talking about and be open to the possibility of perhaps looking at things or perhaps even try feeling things a different way to enable you to have a different relationship with grief being an opportunity for you to grow. So on that note, we have just under 60 minutes together. Mary and I are going to chat for about 45 minutes about all sorts of different things. There will be tears, possibly, more than likely with us two involved, and maybe your own when you're watching this. There will be laughter. It is me. There will be some inappropriate content. I want to say at this stage, nothing I say is meant with disrespect. I also want to voice at this point, some of you that may be watching this, whether it's through this platform or later through a broader platform, you may have only just watched the documentary Be Here Now, and you may be deeply grieving the story that you've just watched. And then you might be watching me listening and laughing and cracking inappropriate jokes. So the other thing I want to bring to your attention is that both Maryanne and myself have had these deep and very rich experiences with loss, with death, with grief, and with growth. And we're talking to you nearly 7 and 8 years on from the very significant life changes that have happened. So I do just want to remind you of that so that I can facilitate wherever you're at, but also you can understand the time that has lapsed in between our experience and now. So on that note, dun, 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 welcome everybody. I want to start with a conversation that is about grief and what grief actually is. And from a psychological perspective, when you look up the definition of grief, it refers to the psychological, emotional experience felt when we lose something or someone we deeply love. And historically, grief is associated automatically with the word death. And so I kind of want to break that up a little bit. But I want to start with, what is grief to you, Maryanne? What would you describe grief as being in your world, in your life?
I've been asked this before, and I think it's really, really hard to define what grief is. And because it's such an open platform of anything that arises with, as you say, loss, great loss, deep loss. And I know that I struggled with, you know, the roller coaster of emotions that grief sort of brings up, particularly early on. And what helped me during that time was writing how I felt, whether it was, you know, what I was feeling from the light outside, what I was feeling about, you know, thinking about my husband and my son, what was going on with my other children. Just, it kind of gave some shape to all these feelings that were going all over the place. So it's a really hard thing to define, but it's almost like something that you follow its lead if you're willing to really feel safe enough doing that. I feel like grief kind of leads the way.
I just love what you just said. You follow its lead, and I just want to acknowledge that we're diving in here, and I'm going to come back to the beginning in a moment. But I love the way you separated yourself from it.
Yes.
Yeah. Instead of it was like it's an entity over here.
Yeah.
So we'll come back to that about consciously uncoupling, if we can, from our grief and observing it almost as a character in our story.
Yeah.
So we'll put that there. I want to bring you guys up to speed if you don't know already. So a bit about my story, which many of you have been privy to and almost walked beside. Beautiful Andy, my husband, my best friend in the world, both Jesse and Indy, my two children's father, the person I genuinely believed I was gonna, you know, walk beside forevermore. Silly, raucous, adventurous, yeah, my partner in crime. And we know the story. If you don't know the story, watch the Be Here Now film. But this beautiful man died at 38 unexpectedly after we thought we were going to defy the odds and beat cancer. He beautifully died in my arms at 39 and saying goodbye to his two children. And so there have been these remarkable moments in my life, like holding your husband and your best friend and allowing them to take their last breath and inviting them to die. And then other crazy moments like readying to tell your two beautiful little children, drawing pictures on a whiteboard of a sleeping father, saying, this is the last time you're going to see your father and your dad. I never say the words mother and father. And then walking in and raising almost Andy from the dead as he was sort of in and out of consciousness in my bossy English voice, preparing him that he needed to find the energy to actually say goodbye to his own children. And these incredible moments that I can always hear people like literally aghast when I share that. It brings, I've seen grown men literally fall to their knees when I've shared this story in much more depth. No one can imagine what that is like. No one can imagine doing it, and yet there are people that face far more atrocious, terrifying, humbling situations, and yet still it is so remarkably unimaginable. And yet those moments in the makeup of my story and who my children are now are so much more than sad. They're so poignant and such significant markers in who we have all become, and through the way we've chosen to embrace that, but have been almost not welcomed, because of course we want it a different way, but upon reflection, when I look at those moments of extreme loss, they have actually been the catalysts for extreme growth. So I'm going to come back to that. So that's a little bit about my story in a very brief way. Before we get into the widow, the solo mummy, the story continues, ... We'll come back to that. And again, just contextualizing this, we're talking about what grief is and giving you a bit of update on our stories. So Maryanne, that was my speed version of my story. And we do this a lot, Maryanne and I, talking about this, and Maryanne particularly having another aspect to her story, which is even more profound. So if you could fill people in a little bit, bring them up to speed with what your story is to date.
Yes, okay. So similarly with the beautiful Vashti, my husband had actually the same sickness as well, and he also died in my arms at home with our children at the age of 43. That's coming up to 8 years. And 2 years after that, my eldest son, who was 15 at the time, Gus, also died of a brain tumour in my arms at home with my children. And so I had two very sick, I had my husband and my son very sick for a few years. So nursed them at home, looked after them lovingly. We had my husband working on an organisation called RUOK, which is to do with mental health and looking after each other. You may or may not know that, but that's something we can talk about a little bit later, or you guys can look into. So Gavin set up this whilst he was sick, and it's a wonderful thing that he's left us with. But that was sidelined to our story of sickness, looking after him, looking after Gus at home, them having very similar journeys of treatment, surgeries and treatments, and also trying to keep my other two children, trying to keep this family as solid as possible whilst going through this.
So there are two beautiful and profound stories. You know, Maryanne's story of her husband and her best friend and her beautiful son. I'm going to use the word dying because it is what happens. Mm. And I want to, given that this conversation has a context of grief and growth, we'll come to the growth. I want to talk about grieving, and I want to talk about it if we break it down into, whilst it's not linear, and even the many people like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross that have written phenomenal books like Grief and Grieving, tried to make it, you know, a staged process. It used to be there were 5 stages to grieving, and then that was completely controversial because so many more people found evidence that it was not linear and that there were other stages. But what I do want to do for those of you, and what really helped me profoundly in my own experience, because I'm this kind of passionate learner, was to try and put some shape and understanding around what was actually going on. And so I want to talk about grief and actually the stage that can happen. And remember, this is not just for somebody who is facing the possibility of someone they love dying, but it could be the possibility of going into retirement. It could be the possibility, as many people that I'm working with right now, who are going to be made redundant. And it's the end of something that not only is a part of our life, but defines who we are, our makeup, our fabric. So this conversation, it doesn't exile anyone and is inclusive of anybody facing something that means that you are letting go and readying yourself and letting go of something powerfully that is a part of who you are. I remember standing in the shower when we weren't in the space that it was, you know, Andy is definitely going to die. It was still, this treatment may work, you know, there was still that hope. And where Andy was very much in the space of, he was not able to talk about if it wasn't going to work.
Yeah.
The only strength he had left in him was to just get through the next round of treatment. So there was never a, let's talk about wills, let's talk about what is it. It was in that place where he didn't have enough to have a more esoteric, spiritual, open conversation. And I used to get in the shower, and a number of you have heard me say this before, so I'm sorry if I repeat myself, but it's very profound for me. And I would, you know, the kids were little and they'd be doing something, I would get in the shower and I would turn on the taps, like literally like, ee, ee, ee. And the moment the water started running, I would just howl, like, well, silently actually, not howl, I would just cry. But while I was crying, I felt monstrous, but I would be planning Andy's funeral. And I would imagine it, not from a detailed perspective, but it was like I was allowing myself from a psychological perspective to anticipate that, and anticipatory grief, or what is also known as the long goodbye. I would from a preparation, I would prepare myself for what might be coming. But simultaneously, the duality of it, I would feel so guilty for even thinking that, like there was a harsh betrayal.
Yeah.
But from a psychological perspective, and I want to share with you, just to give you that awareness, we will always go through some conscious and unconscious preparation to what it is, whether it's going into breast cancer, going into having a breast removed, whether it is going into a different stage of life. Often we will go into this preparation of grief and letting go. And it's super important that we acknowledge that that is a stage, because when we can go, and as Maryanne said beautifully, taking its lead, talking about it as this separate thing, we can acknowledge that it's part of a process.
Yeah.
And when we're in that space, it allows us almost to not get totally consumed by it. You know, to recognize it as a stage and to know that it is healthy and natural and normal to be in that space. Tell me a bit about what that was like for you, nursing Gavin, caring for Gavin, but also, you know, Gus's cancer, many operations for, like, how was that for you?
It was a lot. Obviously, it's a lot. It's a huge load, and Gavin was very real. We were very open about how we were feeling all of the time, and sort of nothing got swept under the carpet. You do away with all of that stuff. So it's very hard to even, as you can see, I'm struggling with all the words, because there's so much going on when there are two people that sick. And Gavin was he was dying first, but he knew, and as did I, that once he died, that I had our son, also very sick, and that was the next stage that I was going to be at. And so I really felt for Gav, my husband, knowing that he was leaving me in this fragile position of having to then nurse our son and say goodbye to him on my own, with my other children, of course, but on my own. But it's as you say, it's part of the stage of facing those things and not sweeping them away. Being able to talk about them was important, and being open with our other children about how our path was playing out. And also, there's a lot of, it's very visceral. You follow your soul, your gut. Everything sort of flows a lot more easily when you don't bump up against those things that are horrible and are hard. And I guess with Gav being a man and a loving father, he was, you know, pretty stoic to the end, even though he was emotional and soft and loving all those beautiful things that came with his personality. We were open and pragmatic with the other kids, is what I'm trying to say. But Gus's journey was different, because he was a child. He was sick from the age of 12 to 15, and he had this beautiful, okay, so this is happening. I have to have a surgery, or isn't today great, Mum? It's sunny. What time are you picking me up from school so we can go for a drive? There was this beautiful balance of the heaviness of what was happening, but the lightness of his personality, and the way he dealt with his sickness was an acceptance and a lightness and almost naivety, but not. It's this level of wisdom, I think, that...
Listening to you, it really reminds me of, and if you haven't watched this, I highly recommend it, and is the TED Talk with JB Miller, who runs the Zen Hospice in San Francisco. And he, very early on in his age, had a horrific accident where he blew his arm and leg off, and had a kind of career ahead of him as a lawyer, and, you know, was sporty and everything. But he talks about very poignantly, when we are going through readying ourselves to die, or potentially with and again, I'm using this interesting reference, but like retirement for a lot of people is such a huge thing, or when we have an illness or a disease where physically we can't use our body in the same way. And the same for somebody who is going through perhaps not terminal treatment, but is going through a deep and dark, challenging illness. Grieving is an important process on a daily occurrence to be able to be in the moment. So what I hear from you is that Gus, beautiful Gus, even though I don't know him, I can't not call him beautiful Gus, the way you share him. He had this tremendous way of, whether it was very personal or he did it privately, and I hear you did this too, was like grieving the loss. Like when I got in the shower, grieving the loss, like processing it on my own way, so you could get out of the shower and come back and be present and enjoy the moment, or enjoy the time you do have. And I see this regularly working with carers who are looking after a loved one, and or people going through a terminal illness where the loss, the fear is consuming, and the terror of losing someone you love can become anger. You know, even before they've gone, this anger can come up and it can dominate. The sadness and the anger and the frustration can take up and steal the time that you do have.
Right. Yeah.
And I talk about this before and after line. You know, that can happen before, leading up to. And we suddenly realize we've wasted so much time being terrified by losing someone or letting go of something in ourselves that we're actually missing life right now.
Yeah.
Even up to being at somebody's actual physical death.
Yeah.
There is a way of having a beautiful death.
Absolutely.
And again, I am being super conscious here that I am referencing those with what I call the luxury of a good death. Acknowledging to those of you that isn't always the case, where there is, you know, an abrupt, traumatic death, which we aren't expecting. So I come back though to that line, the before and the after, that where grief or our aversion of it or us being stuck in a certain stage of it can start to steal away from the quality of our relationships and the quality of life. So I want to hop now to the other side, and the other side being on the other side of the loss, where the career or the job has been taken, the limb has been taken, who you thought was going to be the love of your life, or as somebody I'm working with at the moment, unexpectedly found out that their partner had a whole other life with somebody else, so felt like they had years of their life stolen. And for me, Andy gone, for the children, their dad gone, for you, your beautiful son and your husband gone. So we come onto the other side of grief. And from what we know and what we've talked about, it being non-linear, it not being time-bound, but there are very evidential stages that we do go through when we talk about grief. That stage of absolute denial. You know, for anybody that has nursed somebody, or many people, where you're spending your whole time at hospital, where all of a sudden you're strong, able-bodied, virile man, you're pushing around in a wheelchair. And for me, at the very last moments, and I'm sorry, Spartacus fans, to dash your image of the six-pack healing, strong, gorgeous man, to physically be changing someone's nappy, to go to that space, all of a sudden that is gone. They die. It dies. It's gone. And there's quiet. And there's no hospital visits. And for that little moment, there's this sense of relief almost. And in the lack of caring and giving and hospital visits for me, it was almost like, I call it the quiet period. It was like being on a cloud where I could just go to the cafe with the kids and just walk around. But it was also complete denial. Because the sick Andy had gone, but at some point or somewhere in my unconscious, every time the doorbell went, I'd expect the older Andy to get off his motorbike and come home. And so this sort of denial space, this like you disbelief, suspended belief that this human being that was there, or this part of your life that was, this husband that came home, whatever it is, all of a sudden is gone. And so after that denial, the reality and the harsh stuff sets in. What was that like? What was that like for you? And how, I'm going to use that word, the C word, how did you cope with coming home to your house?
It's the what now, isn't it?
Yeah. And I'm thinking about you, Maryanne, and I have these amazing photos of you. And I'm going to, you know, I say to Maryanne when we work together, I'm like, I'm going to stick the knife in her. And I have this beautiful photo of Maryanne, and there's a family of 5. And then I have another photo, and there's a family of 3. It goes like that. And it makes my heart like collapse on itself.
Me too.
So what was that? What was that like? How does one live through that?
I know, from an outsider's point of view, and even from my point of view, hearing you say it like that to me, I go, yeah, actually, how is that? How was that? Excuse me.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Well, I think, and to reference that point exactly, I remember having a holiday a year after Gus had died. So this was 3 years after Gavin and 1 year after Gus. We went on a big family holiday with extended family, and we were at a resort where there were families everywhere. And all I did was cry every night, watching, you know, parents dancing together with their kids. It was just so gut-wrenching, but still part of what I had to go through. And I'm not saying it was easy, but there was a level of, okay, this is not changing. Nothing's going to change. So how do I process this? How do I get something from this as I'm feeling the hurt? And once again, I think, I don't know, it felt for me like it came naturally, all of that difficult grieving. Like, from one point of view, I felt like every day I was walking around with a handicap. That's how I describe it. It was like I had my arm missing or my leg missing, but no one could see it. But I was limping around. But somehow I had this trust that it would all be okay. And I think also I reference Gavin and Gus going through the agony of, like, the physical agony of suffering, but also the agony of knowing that they're going to die, and they were conscious enough to know that they were dying and having to say goodbye to the people they love the most. That there's really nothing harder in this world that anyone could face. So if they could do that, then I could keep living for them here and looking after my other 2 children and being, you know, a person that was going to be true to myself and not sink into a pile that's not going to help anybody. So that's the early part, the really raw part. And how again, for you, you know, when I talk about grief to growth, when we think about death, loss, it's so finite, the withering of, the closing down, there's always duality, and Jung always writes about this, but even in that, the harshest time, you were able to look at what was going on for Gavin and Gus, and to look at their experience and reframe it in a way that gave you strength and courage and resilience. And I really want to pinpoint something here. Strength and courage are different from stoicism. Like, there's a point when you are caring and nurturing for somebody where you just bunker down and you just do it. And then it's often not even when they die, but it's not until the funeral or when everybody's gone that suddenly the realization of the weight and everything that you have done falls down. But for me, and I really want to own this,
partly because I needed to be healthy for Jessie and Indy, and partly because I knew that it was just going to be me. I was very consciously aware, because of the way, or because of my work, that stoicism, pushing down my feelings, like suppressing them, would make me ill myself. And so my commitment to the kids, but also to being well enough to look after them, it forced me to look at how can I not just get through this, but how can I find a peace in this, even in the most difficult of moments? And so instead of fighting it, trying to lean into it. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. And I think that's where a big part of my growth and my part in this was, and I learned a lot of this from Gus, but I think it's innately part of me as well, is the acceptance I had around what just happened. You know, we did everything we could to make Gavin and Gus better. It wasn't going to happen. Like, it's, instead of playing the "it's not fair" card, how did this happen to us? How did this happen to me? To me, that just feels like wasted energy, wasted negative, you know, possessive sort of energy. That's an acceptance, and that's why Gus lived like he did too. There's a lovely, you know, acceptance around the way he lived. And he didn't worry about his hospital visits, and everything was great. The clown doctors were great, you know, and he didn't feel great all the time, but he lived like life was just precious. And so acceptance has been a really powerful thing for me, and it wasn't something I went, okay, I'm going to pluck acceptance out of there, but it's allowed a freedom of moving forward, because I often say that I sort of would never have known how my life would play out, that I've lost my partner, I've lost a child. I would never have expected that would happen in my life. So neither do I really know what's going to happen next. But so to realise you actually don't have a lot of control over these things, there's a lot of freedom that comes with that. And it's not, you know, lie down and just let life roll over me. You have to still I make choices every day, but it's there's a lovely sense of peace that comes with that. And the same with not letting, you know, following grief's lead. You gently lean into it, is the right word. You lean into it and you feel it, and you trust your gut and your heart, and you keep loving them, and you're honouring them by living like that as well.
And it's interesting what you just said then, because it made me think about, and I really want to clarify this for you all, there is a difference between acceptance and apathy.
Yes.
So acceptance is, this is what it is. I am at this stage. This is happening.
Yeah.
It is here. Meet it. And that doesn't mean being always passive with it, or apathetic, meaning, you know, another aspect, another stage, if you like, of grief is that you're really feeling indifferent. And I know I actually can go through stages myself quite significantly, working with people who are going through very extreme early stages of grief, and I'm working with somebody who recently lost their daughter and is going through a stage of feeling like there is no real reason to go on, you know, that desire not to be here anymore. A very natural stage, you know, trying to re-find purpose in your world when you've lost someone or something that has meant everything to you. I caught myself, and I often catch myself, you know, thinking, and again, everybody, just be conscious of what I'm saying and not reacting to it. Having a thought is one thing. Following it through in action is another. But for me, when I'm working particularly with this woman, there is this sense of apathy where I kind of go, you know, what is the point? You know, if Jessie and Indy weren't here, I've had an amazing life. What do I need to be here for anymore? And I have to catch myself experiencing somebody else's stage of grief, which is that stage of feeling really disconnected to everything and everyone and not seeing any purpose or point. That is also a stage, and to recognize that as Maryanne beautifully crafted earlier, it is a stage. Let it be, but be really conscious that it is a part of the stage and that it will pass. And if it doesn't pass, and there is that another stage that can happen with grief, and again, it's not like this and then this, they go in and out, where we can call ourselves, we can name ourselves as being depressed and going into a dark depression. We didn't have that luxury because of our kids, and for some it's unavoidable. So just be conscious as well that it's okay to go get help. I know that Andy's beautiful mum, as you know, she needed some help at one point. She found it really hard to think about life without her son, so she went and got help to support how to deal with that darkest time. So remember that there are those stages, and knowing about just a little bit of detail about what some of those stages are, even though they are not linear. And so many people contradict what they are in terms of how they're written about, but just a gentle inquiry into where am I? Am I really angry? Am I really sad? And just knowing that, as Maryanne talked about, that if we have acceptance for what it is presenting itself as a stage, there is then this beautiful duality of that's what I'm traveling through, but how can I grow from that? And when I talk about grow has a duality in itself, which is how can I gain from that and how can I give back? Which takes me on to that next stage, which is how to craft meaning and purpose and legacy from our loss. So what does legacy and purpose and converting that unimaginable loss into something of meaning, like what does that mean to you?
Well, even sitting here today having a discussion with you all about two of the most beautiful and important people in my life, I'm growing. I'm honouring them by doing it, for one, and I'm growing. And I've learned as well that moving forward through the experience of having Gavin and Gus die, I'm a different person. I'm not the person I was, but there are huge, big chunks of them that come with me now that I'm really, really present to. And that in itself, I've grown into a human being with these big parts of Gavin, where even stepping into practical roles like, you know, being a bit of a dad here and paying bills and blah, 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 blah. But even more so from his spirit, I've had to step into a role that I would never have imagined. And I take pieces, he's present in me when I step into that. And the same with Gus. You know, Gus had this lightness and laughter and acceptance and gratitude for life. And I have that too. And I've got it, you know, a bolstered version with Gus. And so I live with them coming along with me. And so I've grown myself just, you know, by having these extra pieces of them within me. And I guess, yeah, like giving back, talking openly. Gavin had Are You OK Day as his legacy that he's left us. And you know, that's big and bold. And for my two children, it's wonderful. You know, it's a big worldwide stage that he's left behind. But also Are You OK is all about looking after each other and making sure, checking in on each other, making sure everybody's doing okay, or where people might be struggling. So I've had this support system around me, luckily, which I'm so grateful for, where people are really going to check on me and my kids and make sure that we're doing okay. So he's left that for us as well, like such a gift, such a gift. And then Gus has left this equally important gift of acceptance, and this is what my life was and is. And that's a very gentle sort of legacy, but equally important, I think.
So I can hear do different things there. And I posted this morning this beautiful quote by Mother Teresa, which I'm going to completely and utterly bastardize in this moment. But it's about not everybody has the capacity to, make a giant, profound, loud, bing bang. You talk about Gavin. Gavin's father unexpectedly took his own life, and it was so shocking to Gavin that it's where he created Are You Okay? And Are You Okay, Maryanne talks about very humbly, but it's actually a global, recognized, important support structure to really open arms, check in with those who really are not doing okay. And he went big and passionately and profoundly forward to honor the death of his own father. And then we have Gus, who was humble and accepting. So our legacy can be who we're being. It's not what you have to do. You don't have to create something monumental. Andy wanted to make a film because he wanted to bring purpose and meaning to this unexpected relationship that he suddenly had with the possibility of dying. But he also wanted to use his resources, and he also wanted to put any fear aside of what it looked like or any vulnerability or shame, and he wanted to put himself out there naked, as it were, more than just a loincloth and a spray tan, but naked inside and out to share the unimaginable. And I wanted to continue that for him and continue to do that with whatever I have as a capacity to create something for others. So our legacy can be vast and big, or it can be small and intricate and beautiful in who you're choosing to be. Now, the reason I'm talking about this now, because this whole conversation is about grief, loss, letting go to growth. When we are grieving something, whether it is the death of somebody, or simply that we've got to a stage in our life and we look back and we go, well, shit, that did not turn out how I planned. I don't have any money. I don't have a partner. And we're grieving all the things we thought we would have, and we don't, and it can be crushing. But if we don't recognize that as grief, as its own entity, it is a part thing we need to honor and grieve, we cannot grow. We cannot seize the moment. We cannot live for whatever time we have left if we ignore the fact that we are grieving something. And so that brings me almost to the last part of what I want to talk about before we go to question time, which is like now, 7 years, 8 years on, our children no longer going through letting their parents go, but having grown themselves. How we live every day with grief and loss in our lives. Like we don't recognize as human beings that every day we're losing things. Every day we're grieving certain things. I mean, I'm living in Sydney where people are used to sunshine. And when the summer goes, we have people literally grieving for a month. They're angry, they're lonely. Connection with the outside world goes away because everybody's inside. We constantly have grief and loss in our life, and yet we neglect to realize that there is this duality of longing for something on one hand, longing for it, missing it, wanting it, but then also here, this opportunity to create from what is and what is possible. So bringing you up to like now, your children, how do you on a daily basis dive into allow the loss to be there, but allow the growth to be there simultaneously?
Yeah, I think this little bit further along down the track, I think that first of all, acknowledging how far, where I'm up to, and that I can get up in the morning and live powerfully and, get my kids to school and do the things that I want to do, is first of all, like I say, acknowledgement of, how great that is that I can do that. And it's pretty wonderful and pretty powerful. So that's one aspect of it. I think, as I just tapped into earlier, just being present to the people that Gavin and Gus, and those qualities of theirs that I take with me when I get up in the morning. And it's not like okay, I've got this checklist on board. It's just part of who I am now. And so there's power with that as well. It's a beautiful way to live. I feel like I live with a very open slate. Anything can arrive and I'll be able to deal with it because I have dealt with immense loss and sadness. So there's almost like this, sometimes it has to be a little bit stronger, and I describe it as a coat of armor. Like if there's something difficult I have to do, like, I don't know, go to a funeral of a friend, or, something that's going to bring up real emotion for me. But in an everyday situation, there's almost like this calmness and shield of, I can face most things that are going to happen today. And also I'm going to embrace everything that happens today. I can honestly live with a very full, open, anything can arrive kind of situation. And also you find that people gravitate to you in that field as well, whether they know what's happened or not. I think there's a different way of living. So there's that's growth, a massive amount of growth, I think.
It's interesting. Indy, my daughter, was doing another, they have to just do a lot of speeches in their little school, and we were doing something on human rights and human wrongs, and she was talking about some really, horrific things happening in another country. And she asked me, and she said, Mummy, you always say that everything happens for a reason, and that, everything happens for you and not to you. How can it be that something so terrible is happening for this little girl in this other country? How is that happening for her? And I said to her, it's a really good question, because we can't make sense of the injustices and the horrific things that are happening in the world, and the loss that takes place, or the injustices that happen in our lives. We can't always make sense of it. But all we can ever do is ask ourselves, how and what could this be offering up for me? Like, even if it is the worst of situations, what is this giving you? If we only focus on what it's taking away, we're lost in the darkness of that. We need to grieve what's been taken away, or what we fear being taken away, or the life we wished we'd had, or the relationship we wished. And in the same breath, I tried to explain to her, we can only take responsibility for ourselves in that moment. What can I do with this? And it is always those that have experienced severe situations that have reframed their experience into something remarkable. It's very unusual. Someone's living this fantastic life and they're super happy and everybody's okay, that they have gone out and done something truly remarkable, because out of adversity and challenge comes growth. So on that note, I promised that there would be laughter and tears, and we've managed to squeeze a few out of Maryanne. In my facilitative role, I'm half present to what's happening here and half present to you having your needs met, the broader wonderful community that's tuning in today, tonight, whenever you're sharing this hour with us. But what I wanted to kind of cap it all off with is the conversation of duality. Duality meaning two things taking place at the same time, a depth of two different aspects. And I wanted to invite you to think about that, however difficult it is, your situation, that if you can acknowledge that you are experiencing loss or a grief of sorts, or a need to grieve, if you can acknowledge that and look at what that possible stage is, or find out more about it, and allow yourself, like Maryanne talked about, to be led by it, not overwhelmed by it, but to recognize that it is leading you somewhere. If you allow yourself to lean into that, simultaneously, like another petal on a flower, you allow yourself the opportunity to grow from it. So on that note, because I could literally talk about this for the next 15 years and also break it down into a very structured conversation for each of you going through the different stages, we don't have time today. But if you really enjoyed today, please let us know, and please request more, and we will give you more. So as we bring this webinar to a close, I would like to acknowledge my beautiful friend, the inspiring mother, woman, widow, and CEO and champion of the RUOK organization. Please, Foundation, have a look at it, be an advocate for it, and be an advocate for yourself in how you can embrace loss in your life as an opportunity to not only grow within yourself, but to give back in some way, and embrace embrace grief as an opportunity to create a meaningful legacy. On that note, as always, sending you nothing but love from Maryanne and myself. Bye for now.
Bye.